What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and yes, I know I'm going live early. This was supposed to be at 8 o'clock. However, it sounds like I may have a thunderstorm rolling in, and while I don't think that's going to affect power, hopefully, um, it may degrade the audio performance. So, um, I decided I was going to get going before that seemed to be a problem, or hopefully it is a problem or whatever, and just start early. So, uh, what's up, everybody? I'm Jason. This is the live stream for July 2nd, 2021. Um, on the plate today, I have some. Hang on just a second. On my plate today, I have some administrative stuff I want to talk about. Want to talk about the new camera from Nikon, and I want to talk about the newly announced Canon RF lens. Uh, what's missing in the news, I guess, this week is a lot of people were expecting, or Canon rumors at least was expecting, that Canon was going to announce the EOS R3, and that didn't happen. The reasoning that I'm hearing from, well, primarily Canon rumors, is that uh, Canon, after the, uh, I guess you could call it, debacle with production issues with the R5 and R6, didn't want to repeat that with the R3, and so instead of announcing it and then not being able to provide it, they decided that it was better to hold off on the announcement, which I guess makes sense. Anyway, so talking briefly administrative stuff. As I said, there's a thunderstorm rolling in north of me or whatever, and so that may cause some rumbling in the background. Please excuse that. Additionally, in several previous videos, I have complained about Canon's EOS webcam utility dropping off, just sort of randomly disconnecting from the camera from the computer, and the video stream pausing for while the camera did a reset or something. Um, in the past, what I have been doing is plugging the camera into one of my monitors. They have USB 3 hubs in them, and so they go and they're hooked up monitor to monitor to computer, because that was the easiest way to hook everything up. Uh, so there was two USB hubs between the camera and the computer. I have moved that, which is the camera is now hooked directly up to a USB port on the back of my computer, which is why the background's different. Instead of looking one way on my desk, we're looking a different way. And hopefully we'll see if that drops the video out any better, or drops the video out. If it does, then it's obviously, well, I won't say obviously, it still could be a USB problem. I'm not entirely sure. I'm also running firmware 1.3.3, which is supposed to have improvements in performance or reliability with USB 3 cables for the Canon Canon 5D Mark IV. So, who knows? But we'll see. I haven't seen, I've had this hooked up and running for a while, and I haven't seen any issues while I was getting the stream set up and this was running. So anyway, let's jump into the first thing on my list, which is talking about the newly announced Nikon Z FC camera. Briefly, the sort of big spec items. It's a 20 megapixel DX camera, shoots 4K video, has an ISO range of 100 to 51,200, expandable to 204,800, shutter speed range of 30 seconds to 1/4000th. That can be expanded to 900 seconds in manual mode, so that Nikon has a nice feature of being able to do long shutter speeds set at the camera without going into bulb. Uh, I think everybody should implement that now. An X-Sync speed of a 200th of a second, shoots 11 frames per second, and uses SD cards for storage. I guess maybe the best news on the camera is that it's sub $1,000. Its MSRP at launch is $959.95. Now, what I think Nikon is trying to really differentiate the ZFC from the rest of their product Z line is the retro styling. That's the selling point that the camera has, because as far as I can tell, internally it's a Z50, or functionally it's equivalent to a Z50. They're both 20 megapixels. They both have basically the same performance. You know, I might be off in some little details somewhere because, you know, I didn't spend hours and hours and hours pouring through the specs on each of these cameras because, quite honestly, the specs weren't that relevant to what I had to say, or what I had what I think about the camera. What I think about the camera is, I don't understand this thing that Nikon has with retro designing cameras. So they go on this whole, like, well, it's got a mechanical, which it isn't mechanical. Like, you know, they talk about it like this camera has the same kind of mechanism that a camera built in the 50s or 60s would, but it's all digital. But it's got a absolute encoder for the shutter speed. It's got an absolute encoder for the ISO. ISO is over on the left shoulder of the camera. You know, its controls are laid out like controls were laid out in cameras in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and maybe even into the early 80s. Basically, the time before cost-effective microcontrollers or microprocessors and cost-effective memory allowed cameras to be made essentially purely electronic with I can't even think of the word now, relative encoders that are electrically connected to the processor for inputting settings. Now, from as far as I can tell, the last time Nikon did one of these retro cameras, it was the DF. And the DF was pretty solidly an objective failure. From what I've been able to see, and to put some perspective on this, the DF sold, based on serial number ranges that I've been able to find, or I've found online, the DF sold maybe 80,000 units, which is not an awful lot. It was not it had the same sensor as, I want to say, the D4, so it should have been a pretty solid camera because it wasn't priced like the D4. In terms of, like, image quality reasons, as far as I remember, it was a pretty solid camera in terms of image quality. It wasn't tremendously expensive, especially compared to a D4, and it sold like hardly any units. The D810, as a point of comparison, sold more than 350,000 units, which, you know, and the D800 sold somewhere in the 350, 400,000 units. It might have even been a bit more. The D850 sold more than 250,000 units, if I remember correctly. So taking a good package of electronic sensor, image quality, whatever, and putting it in a retro looking chassis with a retro user interface does not seem like it's that good of a sales proposition. Now, if there's one thing I think the ZFC has going for it here, is that it is sub $1,000 entry level camera, which or at least it's a sub-$1,000 camera, which means that I think there's a bit more room to get over the retro styling and the poor usability that comes with that because the camera's cheap. Now, do I think the ZFC is going to sell as well as, say, the Z50 does? Or is? No, I don't, honestly. But that's also part of the, I don't get the market for these cameras. So retro stuff to me, I mean, maybe there's just the hipster part of things that I don't understand, but retro stuff to me has always seemed like it was the kind of thing that was there to capitalize on nostalgia. So if you were a photographer who shot with a Nikon camera with the silver, the silver and black color scheme in the 60s or 70s or 50s or whatever, and here they come with this camera that's got that same look and those same controls, then, maybe you buy it because, assuming you have the income for it, disposable income for it, but because it plays on you remember the photography that you shot, or you were doing when you were younger, and there's this nostalgia aspect. Maybe it's just a hipster aspect now. I'm not really sure. Like I said, I've always had a problem understanding the fashion side of things. It's just not me. I don't identify, my self-worth and identity isn't based on the brand of shirt I wear or the watch I wear or how flashy my camera is. It's always been far more important to me to have clothing that was comfortable and a watch that functioned and a camera that worked well, took good quality pictures, and did what I need it to do without being overtly like scream, look at me, I'm cool, I have this old kind of looking camera. So maybe there's that whole thing that Nikon's hoping to capitalize on. I just don't know if that's actually a relevant market anymore. Like, I know some people might point to, say, Olympus, except Olympus is doing more, like, they're doing that kind of retro-looking styling, but they're not hampering the camera with a user interface that looks like that was designed in the 60s. Which brings me to the problem with these old, like the Nikon DF and even in this case, the ZFC. The user interfaces are just, we've moved on. And it's not even well, I mean, there's several reasons. Like, we actually understand ergonomics and usability better than we did in the 50s and 60s. It's just the science, if you will, of ergonomics and usability has gotten substantial. Like, there's a lot more research that's been done on it. We understand how to build things that are more efficient for people to use. And this isn't to say that you can't have cool styling or whatever, or even retro styling, but things can be done better, more efficiently now than the way they were in the past. And going back doesn't necessarily, like, there was a reason things were done the way they were done in the past. So specifically, things like the controls on cameras in the 50s and 60s were placed where they were because they had to have a mechanical linkage to something inside of the camera. So you had for example, And you can look in old camera designs. The ISO and exposure compensation dials were stacked because they basically were the same thing. And if you dialed, assuming your camera had a meter, if it was new enough, but if you dialed in exposure compensation, you were really just telling the camera that the ISO was different, because the ISO is actually set by the film, and what you're setting on the dial for exposure compensation slash ISO is just telling the meter in the camera through, you know, a resistance or something to that effect, that it should assume this degree of, you know, this constant, if you will, to compensate for that or to adjust for that. The shutter speed dial had to be placed or in a specific area, in a specific orientation. Generally, we can get away now with having dials, for example, like on a Canon camera, the front dial here is oriented this so that it rotates around an axis this way, the dial's this way, and you can turn it this way. Nikon's front dials, which are lower, you can turn this way, and they're oriented this in this plane with an axis going up and down. We can do that now because that dial doesn't have to have a shaft connected to gears, connected to a mechanical linkage, connected to the clockwork mechanism that trips the shutter and controls the speed that the shutter operates at. And rotating things and moving things when you're talking about a mechanical shaft, yeah, you can put gears to change the angles and so forth, but that one introduces play and slop, which means that it's possible that you change the setting on the dial and that doesn't actually change the setting at the shutter mechanism, so you want to make that as tight as possible. And it also increases the amount of complexity in the system that's already a complex system. And so going back to things like that means that purely for the sake of, well, this is how it looked in the past, you're giving up the convenience and capabilities of a modern camera. So you, instead of, now, like the DF, the ZFC has, as far as I can tell, a front dial, and I think it has a rear dial in the sort of traditional sense for a Nikon camera. So it's kind of, they're both doing the same thing, where they have unnecessarily added controls in a sense, because they can't completely give up or get away from the new design paradigm, if you will, to go to the old paradigm, because you give things up. The shutter speeds on the ZFC, or at least on the DF, and I think this is probably going to be the case on the ZFC, on the mechanical shutter speed dial are in half-step increments, not third-step increments. So, we could argue about how necessary third-stop increments are, but that's a capability that you have through the digital controls, and it's a capability that, like, basically every camera has at this point. But if you want to use that camera in the analog way, it doesn't really work. The last thing I wanted to talk about with the ZFC is the ISO range, which ISO, so I've said this for a while, and I find it, to me, it's rather frustrating, because as much as I've had friends of mine who are Nikon shooters say that I just don't like Nikon, the reality is I like Nikon more than I like Sony. And I think Nikon potentially has a better understanding of photography and photographers and cameras and what the market wants or needs better than I think Sony does. And, one way or another, I mean, I guess that those are sort of my prejudices, if you will, on camera manufacturers. I mean, obviously, I shoot Canon. I like Canon cameras primarily because I like the interfaces on them. But I would personally much rather see a strong Nikon competing with Canon instead of a strong Sony competing with Canon. But that's just my personal thing. But what's frustrated me in recent years is that it feels to me more and more like the marketers are running the show at Nikon, and they're just trying to find, whatever thing that they can put on a package or put in a thing or put on a box or slap a label on or whatever that would make things look attractive to people, when maybe they can't as necessarily, the engineering department can't necessarily deliver that in a usable or a super usable way. And one of those aspects, obviously, in some respects, is the these retro-looking cameras. Yeah, it's this point of differentiation. Oh, look, here's a retro-looking camera. But I'm not sure that that's a point of differentiation that really amounts to something valuable. Again, I'm obviously not a marketer. I'm obviously not in touch with what's hip on Instagram or whatever for people. But I feel, at least speaking from my own position, when you start talking about spending $1,000 for a camera and a couple hundred more for a lens, that the vast majority of people who are interested in photography and who are going to do this, that's a pretty serious investment for them. And I say investment, I really should just say outlay, I guess. And I think by and large, and again, maybe this is just my biases on this, but by and large, I think more people are going to be interested in comfort, usability, performance, and like image quality on the camera could be great. So like it could just be a really good camera in or a decent camera in a silly package. But more people, I think, are interested in what the camera can do necessarily, or how good it is, maybe more than it looks. And so putting this retro camera on the market, there's a level to me where it feels like the marketers are going, well, we're not selling a ton of these Nikon, these Z cameras. What can we do to sell more? We'll put a retro package on it, or something to that effect. And as far as I can tell, Nikon really isn't selling that many cameras. They're losing market share to Canon and Sony. And, that's not an enviable position to be in for a company, as far as I'm concerned. And that may be a big part of kind of what's going on with Nikon, is the sort of corporate panic of we're losing our position, we're losing ground, and we need to do something different. And how do we find something different that will make us sell cameras, as opposed to doubling down on what they know works really well, doubling down on making really good cameras. But anyway, going back to ISO range, this is another one of those points where I feel like the marketers are saying, well, we need big numbers. When Nikon came out with the D5, it had ISO 3.2 million. The D500 has ISO 1.6 million, or equivalent, expanded range. And the big numbers, But when you actually go look at the performance information from places like DxOMark or Photons to Photos, uh, you find that basically the cameras don't deliver. And I mean, I've seen this even personally. I was helping a friend set up his D500 with Lightroom to get the sharpening and noise reduction dialed in, and pictures at 1.6 million and even 800,000 were like almost unintelligibly bad. Like there wasn't a good there wasn't a useful picture there. Now, obviously, the Z50, which is capped at ISO 204,800 equivalently, it's better than trying to race up to 3.2 million. However, if you go look at the performance characteristics of the Z50 and the D500, their sensors match almost exactly. And while the ZFC may be an improvement, it's not going to be substantial because, quite honestly, the well, we've got to stop better low ISO performance just isn't within the realm of or I won't say within the realm. That would be an extremely impressive feat at this point. We've kind of silicon sensors are kind of a mature technology now, and yes, there's things that can be done to improve them, but it's going to be small incremental improvements, not huge improvements in image quality. And with the fact that everything's moving to mirrorless, one of the biggest incremental, if you will, or in target areas of improvements is not actually sensor read noise or dynamic range or anything like that. It's how fast you can read the sensor out, because everything has to go through the sensor, including the viewfinder. Everything's essentially live view now, which means the sensor has to be able to read out fast enough to give you a smooth display and do all the other things that it needs to do. And this is like even more so the case when you start talking about continuous drive and tracking servo AF and all that. The sensor has to be reading for the AF, it has to be reading to update the viewfinder. It has to be doing all of that stuff. And if you can't read out 120 frames a second from the sensor, or potentially even more than that, it becomes very difficult to do all of that administrative stuff necessary to get to taking the picture, never mind taking the picture. But like I said, in the case of like the Z50, ISO 24 or 2000 and 200,000, based on the data from or the chart from Photon to Photos, has a photographic dynamic range of like 0.65 stops. That's not really great. Like that's almost unusable in my opinion. And going back to like the ZFC, if the sensor is probably going to be similar to the Z50 and the D500. It's the same resolution. I can see there being some improvements, but again, I don't expect there to be any kind of dramatic improvement. And that kind of I would expect the performance to be kind of in that range. And it's one of these things like, well, great, there's a big number there, which may sell the camera to somebody because they looked at some big number on the box and they just went, oh, big number, it's bigger than the Sony or bigger than the Canon or bigger than the Panasonic or whatever. But it's going to be hard to justify as a usability point, actually shooting with the camera. So, I'm not going to say the product's doomed or anything like that. I think the ZFC has the potential to be something. If they basically reuse the electronics of the Z50 and just put it in a different chassis, obviously then Nikon's costs for the development of the camera should be pretty low. So that would at least benefit them in the sense that there's a good chance they'll make back the R&D costs, the development costs pretty quickly and turn it into potentially profitable, and they won't need to make a crap load of sales. But I also don't really see the ZFC as being that big of a deal. It's I won't say, like I said, I won't say it's disappointing. It's just, I think it's a niche camera that Nikon doesn't need right now. Nikon really needs to focus on sort of clawing back their former glory. And a lot of that means that, like, from talking to people who are shooting with Z6-2s and Z7-2s, there's systemic issues with the, gee, something just turned off. Oh, well, whatever. There's systemic issues with the technology that underlies the camera. The blackout when shooting at high frame rates, for example, that Nikon really needs to correct, and really needs to correct in a way that's not the Z9. Because the Z9 ain't going to be cheap, and the Z9 may correct it, but the Z9 is going to be a very niche product in terms of what it sells. It's basically a D6 successor. It's almost certainly going to be like a $6,500 or $7,000 camera. I really don't see Nikon trying to sell. I mean, it's positioned as their flagship. So I don't really see them selling it at $4,000 or something like that. And if they do, well, I mean, I guess that's all the more power to them. But if they can get it to sell, but I think you're going to have, I think that would be a mistake too. So yeah, okay, if it can that corrects the issues, that's great. And up until the point that the bread and butter cameras, the Z6 and Z7, need to have the issues corrected too. And that is, in some ways, I think is something that's sort of should be a higher priority. At least if I was running Nikon, it would be a higher priority to me to dial in the the higher end mirrorless cameras that, like I said, the Z6s, the Z7s, obviously the Z9, to be comparable and in terms of performance to what Sony and Canon are putting on the market now, than worry about spending money on developing a entry-level, low-cost, niche styled retro looking camera. Like that I said, if you look at the history with the DF, it did not sell well, and I don't really know if this is going to sell that well either. Okay, so the other note, talking about things that were also announced, Canon announced the RF 14-35 F4l Is USM lens. And hitting the brass tacks on this, it's got obviously really wide angle, 14 millimeters on the wide end, 5.5 stops of in-lens optical image stabilization, up to 7 stops combined with in-body image stabilization in EOS R cameras with in-body image stabilizers, obviously. A minimum focusing distance of 7.9 inches or 0.2 meters. At 35 millimeters, that translates to a maximum magnification of 0.38x, uses a 77 millimeter filter, weighs in at 3.3 inches in diameter, 3.9 inches in length, and 19 ounces or 1.2 pounds. That works out to be 540 grams, and I have no idea why I didn't put the metric dimensions for the length and diameter in my notes, but I didn't, so my apologies. And is going to run about $1,700. I think its MSRP is $1,699 even, or something like that, but basically $1,700. And this is an interesting proposition to me, because 14 millimeters is really wide on a wide angle lens. And this isn't giving up on the long end. So Canon has, what is it, the 11 to 24 f4. Sony has a 12 to 24 f4, and I think they even have a 12 to 24 f2.8. They give up that 24 to 35 millimeter range on the long end. Now, obviously, excuse me, obviously they're giving up that long end range to give you even more wide end. And 10, 12, 11, 12 millimeters is substantially wider than 14 millimeters. Basically, every millimeter you go wider on a wide angle lens is way, way, way bigger of a jump and way more impressive than, say, 10 millimeters or 15 millimeters on a telephoto. So a 14 millimeter is going to be dramatically and obviously wider than a 15 millimeter, which is going to be dramatically or obviously wider than a 16 millimeter, in a way that a 135 is not that much more. It doesn't have the same kind of dramatically more telephoto perspective than, say, a 105 or a 100. What really makes this an interesting question for me, at least personally, is I love shooting ultra wide angle. It's I just find the resulting images interesting. It's a perspective I don't see the world from in a in a daily basis. However, I don't really find that I have a lot of use to shoot ultra wide angle. For starters, it's hard. You have to be super aware of so much of the environment that you're shooting in, like of what's there, what's distracting, what the angles are. Is there somebody walking down the sidewalk a block away off in a angle that you just, like, they walk through the corner of your frame or something like that. And like I said, as much as I like it, as much as I find it really cool and interesting to make pictures with, I also find that it's sort of really extremely challenging to make pictures with. And then compounding that, a lot of the situations where I want to shoot an ultra wide image, not necessarily ultra wide angle, but just a really wide image, to print as a large panorama kind of thing, I find that it's not really conducive to shoot an ultra wide frame, then crop out 50% of the image to get to the part that I want that's interesting, that makes a panorama. And it's not usually all that conducive to me to have a picture where I've got, half of the frame is empty sky or uninteresting sky, or just kind of crap clouds, because the really interesting clouds are the ones by the horizon on the mountain, by the mountain or something like that. And so generally speaking, what I find is, as much as I like shooting ultra wide, I just don't do it. It's not that it's not that big of a priority for me, and that's kind of why I find this lens interesting. I think is the other alternative right now for the RF shooter is the 15 to 35 f2.8. And so you lose a millimeter wide angle. You have the same telephoto end, but you lose a millimeter of wide angle, which by and large, as much as there is an obvious difference between 14 and 15 when shooting, I'm going to say it's kind of neither here nor there in terms of, like, one doesn't make something obviously better or worse. You can use a 15 to 35 and a 14 to 35 in basically the same scenarios, at least as far as I can see. But the f2.8 aperture means that lens is better for doing like night sky landscapes and astrophotography, or mostly night sky landscapes, because it's faster. And so you can either run the ISO a tad lower, or you can resolve fainter stars, or namely running the ISO a tad lower, a stop lower. Where the F4, the 14 to 35 F4 though really makes an interesting case is, so start with it's smaller and lighter. It's 10.6 ounces or 300 grams lighter than the 15 to 35 2.8. It's an inch or 1.06 inches or 27 millimeters shorter, and it's 1.1 or 0.17 inches or 4.4 millimeters smaller in diameter. Now, the smaller in diameter part's not really meaningful in terms of putting it in a bag or carrying it, but the shorter and lighter kind of is. And if you're talking about a lens that's maybe not your most used lens, or something that's heavily used, compact translates to, especially in light, translates to being something that you're much more apt to carry, because it's not putting a lot of weight in your bag, which means you're not paying as much of a penalty for that. However, I think that maybe real kicker is it's cheaper. It's $1,700 versus $2,300. Now, $2,300 is, what's that? So it's $600 more expensive for an f2.8 lens from the f4 lens. And that's where I think, things are kind of, that's more of the up in the air thing, right? So for some people, that stop faster aperture is absolutely going to be worth $600. I was, in my mind, before this lens was announced, I was sort of on in the position of, I was just going to go 15 to 35 2.8 because I could do that and the 24 to 70 2.8 and basically cover all the wide angle end things with f2.8 glass, and just not have to really compromise, because the RF glass and cameras are light enough that I could sort of take the hit, so to speak, in terms of bag weight and what I'm carrying. But to me, and I guess in some senses, that the stop faster aperture isn't necessarily worth $600 to me, and the extra weight, because again, I don't, as much as I like ultra wide, I don't really use ultra wide lenses, at least that often. And I've already got a 24 to 70 f2.8, and 24 is kind of plenty wide for doing night landscapes. 15 could make some really interesting pictures, but on the same token, yeah, I don't know. So this is another interesting one in a sense to me, because it took what I had as a preconceived notion about where I wanted to go with glass. And this is something I have found that's been happening to me over and over and over again with Canon's EOS R and the RF system. They either, they announce something, or they produce something, or they do something that I, at first glance, dismiss because I don't like that, or this thing is not really that good, or like the 100 to 400. I was convinced when that was first announced that it was going to be a day one purchase. As soon as I got an R5 or an R, I was going for a 100 to 500. Then I found out that the teleconverter only mounts at 300 plus. And that's, to me, bad design. I understand why that's the case. I understand the, weight, image quality, blah, blah, blah. But it's bad design to have to dismount the teleconverter, to me, on a zoom lens to zoom the lens all the way out to its shortest focal length. Primarily because I don't, as a tangent, when I'm looking at telephotos, especially zooms and especially with teleconverters, I don't think of the lens as, say, we'll just say the 100 to 500. I don't think of it as 100, I zoom from 100 to 500, and then I put the teleconverter on to get 700 or whatever it ends up being. Because the whole point of the zoom to me is having the flexibility to back off without having to unteleconverter. With a prime, it's a different thing. You can't really, you can't zoom at all. So if you want to back off, you just have to take the teleconverter off. But with a zoom, you can, as the bear, buffalo, lion, leopard, elephant, whatever is coming closer, you can zoom to a wider angle position, a shorter focal length. You're still using the teleconverter, but for instance, with the 140, the 100 to 400, if I've got the teleconverter on, yeah, my bottom end is 140 millimeters instead of 100 millimeters, but that's often more useful to be able to zoom out to that than it is to miss the shot entirely because I'm trying to take the teleconverter off, or I wreck a teleconverter because I'm trying to take it off and I drop it, or I have to carry two cameras with two lenses that are essentially identical, but one has a teleconverter on it. So anyway, back to the point. I flip-flopped on that. I wanted it. I didn't really care. And I'm back in the, I'm looking to get one whenever I can. The same thing goes wide angle. When I originally heard that they were going to do a 14 to 35, I kind of went, I don't, whatever. I want to go 15 to 35. I want the 2.8. But, stepping back and looking at, and I think this is the real lesson. If you're going to buy gear, you really need to step back and look at what you actually do with the camera, do with in your photography, and how that gear will either enable you to do things or will make what you're doing better. And for the money, and think of it, work it that way. So you don't want to just, necessarily drop. And this is why I'm glad I didn't end up getting that 28 to 70 f2 ultimately. Yeah, it sounds cool. Yeah, it's an f2 zoom. Wow, that's awesome. But ultimately, it doesn't enable, or wouldn't enable me to do something tremendously different from a 24 to 70. The f2 wouldn't enable me to, it doesn't improve the environment or the pictures that I'm shooting, because generally I'm shooting stop down anyway, and it was a lot of money for essentially something that was shiny, not this would really improve my capabilities in photography. Whereas in this case, the 14 to 35, and it actually being announced, so it's not just a rumor, because it's easy to dismiss something like that. This is a rumor. But actually being announced kind of makes me pause and go, do I really need the f2.8? Can I do an f4? It's smaller, it's lighter, and that's a big plus in my opinion, compared to bigger and heavier and for a stop faster. It's image stable. Both of them are image stabilized. Anyway, so I thought this was an interesting announcement in the sense that it poses, at least for me personally, it poses some interesting challenges on trying to figure out where to go glass-wise. Because I think that's a challenge I think we all have, right? We don't have endless budgets. We can't just buy every piece of glass that the camera companies manufacture as much as we'd like to. And so, you know, we have to make tough calls on what's really important to us versus what's just a nice to have. So anyway, I'm going to wrap that up there. I have been going far longer than I really had intended to go in this video. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. Please consider subscribing. You might want to hit that notification bell. I don't post regularly, at least not regularly like as YouTubers, so content kind of comes on its thing. I do live stream when there's something worth talking about, in my opinion, on Fridays at somewhere around 7:30 or 8 o'clock. It's starting to get earlier and earlier. That's Eastern time in the United States. So you tune into that. Anyway, as always, again, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.